Alright, everybody. Good evening. My name is Benjamin, and welcome to another little discussion. I guess we're going to be talking about campaigning throughout history, and we're starting with 1930s now. Really, this is just kind of a continuation of the previous era in a lot of ways with how campaigning was done, though radio started becoming a lot more prominent. A lot of people think FDR was the first president to regularly use radio. However, that is not true in the slightest. Ooh, ooh, that's good. That's really good. And the first president to actually use radio fairly regularly was Calvin Coolidge, maybe hilariously or ironically, considering Coolidge's nickname was Silent Cal. However, Republican dominance of the early part of the 20th century was ended by an event known as the Great Depression, which started in 1929. Now, everybody's going to jump on and say, oh, it was the excesses of the 1920s and all that stuff, and if there hadn't been such a staunch non-interventionist in Herbert Hoover, the Depression would have been over much sooner. Well, the reality is there was a Depression in 1920 that hilariously has similar parallels to the one to the economic and global troubles that we have today. I may talk about that at some other juncture, why 1920 and 2020 are eerily similar, and how for the Depression that started in 1920, really no one noticed, and historians pretend it never happened a lot of the times for a few reasons. Number one, you had someone who almost certainly would have been an interventionist in the economy. After all, he did start the Federal Reserve, he implemented the income tax, and he basically implemented a lot of government programs to try and boost production and all sorts of other things, effectively aggregate demand stuff. During the First World War, the Great War, and Woodrow Wilson. However, Woodrow Wilson was incapacitated during the Spanish flu and the Depression that kind of kicked off around that point, because he had a stroke. Warren G. Harding won with Vice President Calvin Coolidge. And Harding, while he was a career senator and occasionally would work across the aisle and also work against what his own personal beliefs were, that's Harding, right? Yeah. Harding's inclination was, generally speaking, to not do anything. However, he was also the type of person who, if he saw an opportunity for some sort of gain or some sort of compromise, working with others to get something that more people would agree with, he would. So he would occasionally spend more of it boost government spending, that sort of thing. Coolidge, on the other hand, grew up as a poor farmer in super southern Vermont, and was basically the Scrooge of this era, and he thought that there was no role in the economy for the government, there was no role for regulation. And Coolidge really kept Harding honest regarding this, up until the point Harding had a heart attack and died, and Coolidge became president. Now, there were a lot of Republicans Oh, and by the way, the government did nothing during this depression, and yet we don't hear about the Great Depression starting in the 1920s. Instead, we hear everything about the Roaring '20s. And the market crash that preceded the 1920 depression was actually greater than the market crash in terms of percentage dropped than the market crash of 1929. In addition, unemployment increased at a much higher rate than the first couple of months of what we call the Great Depression, starting in 1929. Yet, it's kind of the forgotten depression because it didn't last at all. Now, free marketers like myself will use this to point out and say, hey, listen, depressions happen. If you don't do anything, they heal. Whereas people who want a little more interventionism say, that was luck. Or something else to hand wave it away, right? But Coolidge, of course, because he wasn't exactly the spendthrift that others of his era may have been, the Republicans really didn't like him at first, but they didn't have an obvious replacement for him, so they ran him in 1924, not expecting much. And then he absolutely crushes his Democratic opponent, including winning a few solid South states. Now, you could argue that was because his opponent was also Catholic, but yeah, okay, I'll give him, I'll give the benefit of the doubt on that one because anti-Catholic sentiment was extremely high in that era. Coolidge wound up being surprisingly popular. Even for an era where Republicans dominated everything, Coolidge was surprisingly popular, especially given his personality. Also, fun fact, he may have had more pets than Teddy Roosevelt. Yeah. Including 2 pet lions that he named one the budget bureau or balanced budget, and the other tax cuts, which is probably the most Coolidge thing ever. But anyway, so Republicans expected him, due to his popularity across the nation, as well as his apparent effective governance that was extremely principled, and that he never broke with his own principles and philosophy. They expected him to run in 1928 and obviously and win in a landslide against whoever the Democrats put up. I think it was Al Smith. But Coolidge declined for personal reasons. I think one of those was that he didn't want to be a president who died in office because, well, the presidency is highly taxing, and we had already seen Wilson have a stroke and then Harding die in office. So Coolidge was considered himself lucky to have survived an entire term. So he retired. Now, Coolidge did not like Herbert Hoover because Hoover was actually an interventionist in the economy, and Coolidge was not. Again, that should be fairly obvious. However, Coolidge didn't say anything about it because it wasn't his style to rock the boat, so to speak. So he allowed Herbert Hoover to basically become the Republican nominee in 1928, whereas Coolidge would have preferred somebody like, say, his Treasury Secretary, Andrew Mellon. Hoover won easily, and then the Depression hits. The market crashes in his first year in office. And Hoover gets the blame, especially for the never-ending depression that ensued after that market collapse. And Hoover was very interventionist in this. He basically told businesses, don't fire anyone, don't cut wages, we'll do what we can to make sure that you can survive this. And he started big government spending projects such as the Hoover Dam, and began a lot of the policies that FDR would later be praised for implementing. And yet, under Hoover, they weren't effective at all. So he runs up against FDR, who doesn't even have to campaign because Hoover has gotten the blame for the Depression and the fact that it hasn't abated. Then FDR cruises to a re-election campaign against Alf Landon, and I'm just gonna actually let's I want to go to Phil, and FDR wins every state but Vermont and Maine. The victory was so crushing, in fact, that people actually put signs at the borders of both states saying, "You are now leaving the United States of America," as a bit of a joke, obviously. And later, Republicans would start to gain states back as they not necessarily regained form, but as is relatively natural when somebody wins that kind of a landslide, people will sour on the party in the White House. It's kind of natural. It's why we have the modern pendulum theory of presidential politics and presidential elections. And this is where I would normally start really being very difficult, a bit pedantic regarding FDR and how I'm not a big fan of him running in 1940. Because at the end of the day, he had 2 terms, and Washington had set a precedent of only running for 2 terms. And I'm not a big fan of people breaking precedent for no reason, and truthfully, I genuinely believe that there was no good reason for FDR to run for a 3rd term. I'm a little bit less hard on him for 1944, but I'm still not a massive fan of his 1944 bid either. Now, as you can see here, Wendell Willkie just couldn't compete. And part of the reason why 1940 still went to FDR, even though he'd had 2 terms, and the sentiment was not exactly favorable towards FDR. Basically, the idea was, you've had your 2. Problem was, his New Deal programs were popular. I'm not going to argue that. I can argue all day that they were ineffective and didn't really do much in terms of improving the economy, but they were popular. And whether or not they benefited the economy and the average person doesn't really matter, due to, number one, their popularity and the psychological impact that they had. Because people liked the TVA and, of course, the alphabet soup that was the New Deal. They liked Social Security. They liked, I believe it's Medicare. No, I think Medicare and Medicaid came in the Great Society of Lyndon Baines Johnson. But people liked those programs because, at the very least, it looked like the government was trying to help out the average person who had lost everything. In addition, what were the Republicans offering? A return to Coolidge? And the Democrats had a field day with that because it's like they could argue, well, the policies of Coolidge were what got us here in the first place. Why would we want to go back to that type of austerity? So, even though the era of Coolidge was an era of great prosperity, entering 1939 and 1940, the country was still in the Great Depression. And the only reason the economy was starting to come back was because of Lend-Lease to the Allies for World War II. And that only began really at the very end of 1939 and the beginning of 1940. So even then, it just wasn't a lot of it just wasn't a lot of activity. But it was enough for FDR to argue, listen, I'm making progress. And that was good enough for people to give him the pass. In 1944, of course, we're in the middle of World War II. We had just successfully had the Normandy invasions and were making progress in France. The island hopping campaign in the Pacific was going extremely well. We were selling everything we could to both Britain. Now that France was back in, we were starting to help out the French. The United States was sending tons of steel, bombers, planes, tanks, everything that we felt was reasonable to send to the Soviets. I think a lot of people forget that there was a lot of Lend-Lease sent to the Soviets. And people will debate how much U.S. Lend-Lease helped the Soviets. And a lot of people, and the problem is, post-war, especially once you get deep into the Cold War, 60s, 70s, a lot of Soviet sources will start stating that it didn't matter. The Soviet Union could have done it on its own. Whereas you listen to actual contemporary accounts from the Soviet Union, such as from General Grigory Zhukov, as well as a few other members of Soviet high command, including Stalin himself, saying that U.S. Lend-Lease was instrumental to the Soviets surviving. I take a bit of a middle ground. I think U.S. Lend-Lease absolutely helped and was a significant contributor on the Eastern Front. After all, there were Shermans on the Eastern Front. But the Soviets probably could have survived without U.S. Lend-Lease, but it would have been a much longer grind than it really was. Probably a 1946-47 end date to the war in Europe without U.S. Lend-Lease. And I think people forget that, yes, the U.S. really did have that much manufacturing, and that was predominantly in the Rust Belt. So, you get to the end of World War II, FDR is passed, obviously, and Harry Truman is now the president. And what does Harry Truman have to show for the immediate aftermath of World War II? The start of what is becoming a Cold War. Sure, there's economic growth, and it seems like the United States is not going to slide back into a depression, but Truman doesn't have too much of an actual campaign apparatus. He doesn't really have that much to show for it, so much so that papers famously say that, yeah, Thomas Dewey is going to win. And I'm going to go and pull that map up to 1948. And because Truman decides not to segregate the U.S. military and the U.S. government, You have a rebellion of Southern Democrats led by Strom Thurmond, who was a senator at this point from South Carolina, and would serve in the U.S. Senate until the year 2000. Yes, he was a centenarian, as in he was over 100 years old, and he was still in the Senate. And he had changed his political party by this point, and he was actually a Republican after 1964. And I may get to that, okay? But as you can see, the Republicans still control, or still have a lot of support in the Midwest, the breadbasket, right? The Great Plains area, New England and Mid-Atlantic area, as well as support in what we would call the Rust Belt, but back then they would call the Industrial Heartland. Democrats still control the South. But as you can see, things are starting to swing. And of course, the famous Dewey defeats Truman headline is still hilarious in hindsight. And then, let's be honest here, the election would have been much more competitive in 1952 had you not had popular General Dwight Eisenhower running as the Republican. So, yeah. And this is kind of where we reach the one of the final transition points between how campaigns are run. Because television is a growing technology. It's still not the most prominent method of getting messages out to the people. That's still radio, as well as newspapers. And the last election I'll pull up is 1956, where where Eisenhower still wins in a massive, massive landslide. As you can see, the solid South isn't all that solid in this era. And this was another rematch, of course, because apparently in the early 20th century, rematches were all the rage. And like I said, Eisenhower's extremely popular for a lot of reasons. Number one, popular general from World War II. He effectively a war hero. He had started building the interstate highway system as both a defense network, and in this era, we already had the Red Scare going on with McCarthyism, named after Senator Joe McCarthy from Wisconsin, as well as the idea of we have to somehow form a bulwark against communism and prevent its spread, aka the Truman Doctrine, make the world safe for democracy. So things such as the Korean War to prevent the northern half of the Korean Peninsula under Kim Il-sung from taking over the South. Now, the South was a U.S.-backed dictatorship. It was, but the South eventually became a very democratic nation. Of course, there was Vietnam. I believe Vietnam was also split, though Vietnam was really messy. And at this point in time, it was still a predominantly French versus Vietnam conflict because of decolonization. And decolonization had already begun in the world, with a lot of African colonies starting to gain independence in the 50s and 60s. India had gained its independence from Britain in 47, with some stuff between Pakistan and India regarding Kashmir and Jammu. um, which is a really interesting topic in and of itself. But you begin to see that times are somewhat changing. It doesn't really appear as such when looking at the maps, but if you look at the margins of each state, there were some trends that were going on because the Republicans had kind of been lost in the woods for almost 2 decades, from 1928 to 1948. And they had to reinvent themselves, and a lot of more conservative Republicans started making a name for themselves. Barry Goldwater, for instance, your Richard Nixons. Now, Richard Nixon was actually fairly moderate even into his own presidency, but the fact that, your Barry Goldwaters, your Joe McCarthy's, these Republicans that we would actually recognize as Republicans today were starting to gain steam in the Republican Party. Yes, there were still your Nelson Rockefellers, your Dwight Eisenhowers, who Eisenhower was fairly in the middle, though he was, generally speaking, the type of person who would still be probably a Republican today, but would definitely be on the moderate or even liberal end of Republicans. What you see is that the Democrats also were becoming a much more liberal party in terms of their social policy and all that stuff. The Republicans were still very much a party of civil rights. After all, Eisenhower was the one who sent the 101st to enforce Brown v. Board in Arkansas. And you still have some prominent conservative Democrats, George Wallace, for example, be a good one. Strom Thurmond at this point is still a Democrat. So you're starting to see the seeds of what would be the big realignment. Because at this point, both parties are still big tent parties where there's liberals and conservatives on both sides. There are, free marketers, there are interventionists in both parties. And foreign policy is almost entirely dictated by how anti-communist you were. So when we get to the next election, we can start talking about how television changed everything, because it really did. I think 1960 was pretty much the tipping point of when television took over as the predominant means where Americans were getting their information. I'm going to go ahead and end the video now before I drag this out too far. I want to say thank you all for watching. If you like the content, likes, comments, subscriptions, they always do help, and I greatly appreciate them. I do have a Patreon. Tomorrow, I should have my model fully updated for the almost 2 weeks I missed. And I'm going to be live streaming at around 9 p.m. tomorrow night. And I look forward to seeing all y'all there. And have a very good evening. I'll see y'all next time. Take it easy. Bye-bye.